welcome back to Perk Industries. Yes, Perk. Well, in this current state of lockdown, there's a bit more time on our hands to get involved in ideas, and that's a pretty good thing from my perspective. Without really thinking about it, and again over the sort of course of maybe about 4 years, we've put together a little idea called 5 knobs. This is 5 knobs. 5 knobs is probably the most technologically advanced idea that we've done to date, and this comes down to a number of factors, but let's talk about that. 5 knobs came about pretty much because the internet continues to offer some fantastic ideas and inspiration for things you can go to make. Some of those things, hopefully, are slightly more advanced than the last ones that you did. I've done a lot of work with creating drones, oscillators, sounds that are generally based on some kind of quite simple, normally logic-based loop or drone that is made from a low voltage. I watched a video, and this video was the inspiration for this project. The guy in question put together a video for a sort of DIY enthusiast internet channel. What he did was he put together a small box, had 5 potentiometers on the top and an on and off switch. Pretty simple. He spent more time in the video making the box itself. He prided himself on his woodwork and his metalwork, but I was more interested when he plugged it in on the sounds it was making. Turns out this DIY synth was powered by something called Arduino. Now, Arduino is something I've avoided without any rational explanation. I've never really played with it, although I'm familiar with the PIC technology and EEPROM, but I've never really got stuck into Arduino before. I was kind of prompted into getting stuck in by this video. Now, it's worth noting that the video showcased an Arduino prototype board called a Nano. And again, I'm pretty much unfamiliar to this. I am to the concept, but to the models, the brands, and how it works. The video on Instructables showed us then how he went about coming up with some code. And the code was really pretty much dependent on something called the Mozzi library, and that is M-O-Z-Z-I library. And the Mozzi library comes from a sort of a forum, a collection of like-minded people called GitHub, which you can find if you ever search online. The Mozzi library, though, is taking the Arduino and developing to it more capability for actual useful sound. So not beepy bleepy beepy blonky plonky sounds, but actually some more granular synthesized drones that you can manipulate with a bit more thought and care, according to whatever you deem fit in the code. So GitHub and Mozzi are the two starting points really to go for really when you get involved. And with this free time on hand, I thought, well, let's have a look at Arduino. So I dutifully went online, and I went and I bought one of these. Now this is a Nano soldered 5-volt mini controller. The auction said it was a CH3406 for Arduino. He was selling it from my town, so I thought, April the 11th, yeah, I'll buy 2. They were pretty cheap, as you can see. I thought, yeah, I'll get 2. For that price, if it goes wrong, it's not really the end of the world. I knew the download of the software was free, so I thought I'd have a go. So I thought it was easy. It really wasn't. The first port call was the effect that the postage surface here has had, sorry cat, on terms of COVID-19. So COVID-19 has obliterated Royal Mail, bless their cotton socks. We have found, actually, that it took 2 weeks for the Auduino, which was for sale in my hometown, to come back to my house. It took a long time. Once that happened, then the next step was to download the software, which you can, as I said, get for free, either as an online platform or as something that you might download to use. And most of these Arduinos are pretty expensive, so I thought I got a bargain with mine. They're filled with their own bootstrapping, they're their own design, their own sort of particular ICs for doing a lot of the data transfer. And the main issue in particular is the data transfer between computer and USB to the prototype board, which is obviously quite an integral part of the system. Turns out that most of your normal Joe Bloggs Arduinos that you might pay a normal price for tend to come with far more advanced software. Certainly software that the drivers in Windows are happy to find. Turns out CH3406 is a bit of a twat, really. It requires going to Chinese site to try and download the driver. The driver is unstable, doesn't always unpack and unload. And I lost about 4 days frustration trying to find a way to get my computer and this software to talk to each other and to download the code. The code was actually quite straightforward, dare I say. It's a variation on the C language. And Mozzi is a library that gives you a load of commands that are already loaded up in terms of sort of paragraphs of coding that you can sort of drop in. And I had an idea based on the guy who put together the initial Instructables video and where to start with that, and really just sort of taking his and evolving it a little bit. So with the code, with the software, that was fine. The main challenging issue was to then get the computer to talk to the board and to download effectively. We went through a whole series of variations in trying to get any sort of successful download. Any of you hoping to try this, just some top tips for this. Use the forums, the Arduino forums, pretty useful. There's some sarky people on there. Yeah, they're very knowledgeable and they know that, but yeah, look through the forums. I wouldn't wade in and sort of state your problem, but there will be some sort of solution there on what you could do. Use that first. The second thing is you'd be surprised at how rubbish some of these cables are for transfer. For example, let me show you the cable that I ended up using. This was from a video that you might remember we did a few weeks back that covered some of the car boot Euro rack, and part of that was a little circuit I had with a laser harp, and in order to power the laser harp it gave you one of these tiny little leads. Now I've got about 10 different variations on these sort of USB connections here. My wife buys a bunch of them because they charge her bike lights, for example. So I've got loads and loads of these leads. They work well with all the GoPro cameras. They pretty much link most modern day sort of budget, economic sort of electronic product that requires either connection to computer or some kind of USB power mode to charge. I had stacks of them. You would not believe how many I tried in order to try and get this thing to download, and it turned out the cable was the main issue. This one is pretty much the only one that worked, which is brilliant when you're trying to plug it in around the back of your desktop PC. Really difficult to do. Extension leads just add more issues. So that's the second top tip. Third one is USB 3 is not the way forward. Apparently it is a bit too much for the little Arduino boards to cope with. So may I suggest that if, for example, you use a little USB hub, again, much like the ones we use for the power supplies for the car boot Euro rack, just some little USB hub to break the feed from 3 down to USB 2 will make your chances of downloading more successful. That's just my top 3 tips. Again, if you've got other issues occurring, I'll show you a little one in here. Say, for example, you are using, again, one of these CH3406 boards. If I just show you up in Arduino here, in Tools, you will find that there are a range of boards. I had some success using mine as Nano, which is the sort of closest model to it. Other people have used this one that I can't pronounce, as well as a Micro in some cases. Make sure that the port is not grayed out like this is here. If that's the case, then you need to get a device manager and you need to make sure the driver works before Arduino will even think about downloading your code. Finally, This is not the correct processor that I'm supposed to choose. It just turns out to be the only one that worked. Look, my advice here is try all of the settings if you have a problem doing so. So that was the front end. You can see also on the screen at the moment we've got some of the code. This is the Mozzi library code. This is all available if you go into have a look at the examples. There's a whole bunch that are built into Arduino, and if you scroll down here you'll see the Mozzi library, and the code that we actually ended up using came from a sensor for knob light level, and this was the basis for where we went forward with the code that we used. There was some modifications to it. This one I believe was for 3 different analog inputs, so the 3 different potentiometers that were the dials for the sound, and that was sort of the start of some of the sort of messing around with getting some interesting sounds from it. So that was the first part. The other sort of modern technological advancement that we had was 3 years ago I started messing around with some 3D printers without ever really coming up with anything particularly useful. You know, I made some things like mobile phone holders or SD card media holders, things like that, you know, just because I had access to one and it was worth sort of trying to make some outcomes just to see if I could, again, get SketchUp, for example, to speak to a modern day 3D printer. But one thing I did do, and I'm glad now with hindsight, was to come up with some of these enclosures. Now these enclosures are quite straightforward to do. Again, it's taking someone's design, it's sticking it into a piece of hardware and seeing if it works. Up on screen now is the design that I used. This was found on a website called Thingiverse, and on Thingiverse we found this basically just a guitar effect casing. Quite a nice sort of straightforward design. You can see here where there are sort of pillars to mount the bass on top. Came with some holes that were already part of the design. I filled those back up because I wasn't sure what I was going to do with this design. And here you can see his 3D sort of design that he came up with in order to make the casing. So that was one I chose to print. It probably took about 7 or 8 hours for it to do the the whole sort of printing out of the outcome. Although, yeah, I'm quite happy with it. No, not the colour. Some nice sort of Bakelite-y looking dials on the top. Classic badge on the front. And then at the back, jack output. And sticking with my sort of USB theme, which I've been doing for a few weeks now. It just so happens the Arduino is powered by 5 volts. So there's an adjustable USB to power it there. And again, that's very, very straightforward in terms of, you know, if you need to go ahead and find some kind of plug, your USB can plug into any sort of cheapy phone adapter and that will run just fine. Again, extendable lead so that you can fit it into whatever you need. So that was pretty much the plan, but what I didn't expect was when we plugged it in, how many varied sounds and how many useful sounds there were from this tiny little circuit. When you look at the actual Arduino circuit itself, it is teeny, and the capability in terms of its onboard memory is pretty good. The code that we put in actually almost filled it. There was a warning sign to say, look, you're approaching the limit of what this can do here, but it still seemed to work absolutely fine. So to that end, I was really impressed. Coming back to Eurorack again, when we put that up on YouTube for people to watch, a few of the comments said, you know, it's nice to be able to try and get some kind of ambient sounds from what is essentially, you know, bits of crusty old kids' toys that have been discarded, to try then and generate from something quite harsh and quite brutal, which a lot of the circuit bent outcomes are, to try and synthesize something that's a little bit nicer, a little bit smoother around the edges. Often the circuit bent outcomes that you're seeing here in people's music are really, really nasty, and you don't always want that. I was starting to wonder, and then this came up in the comments on YouTube, was whether or not it is actually possible to try and straddle that fine line between sort of ambient sounds on one hand and noise on the other hand, and how those two sort of marry together. This is really nice in terms of that. It's some really nice sort of drones, granular sort of shaped sounds, waveforms. There's a kind of tremolos, filters, but the way they interact with each other as sort of 5 different influences are really cool. The way the whole thing comes together is quite nice. So let's plug it in and I'll show you what it does. Now, if you like the sound of that, and that's something you're interested in, I wholeheartedly suggest that if you are of the type of person that might be interested in getting involved with Arduino, looking at downloading some code and uploading it to a prototype board. Again, take the advice, buy an Arduino prototype board. You'll find them on eBay, you'll find them from the site themselves. Stay clear of the Chinese counterpart. Look out for the CH3406. They may be cheap, but they're a bit of a pain to work around. Or if you like the idea of the sound, but maybe not necessarily the build, we can be strong-armed into maybe building one for you. So please get in touch if that's something that you would quite like. This is our first prototype, so this is the first 5 knobs we've done. And yeah, if you're interested, leave us a comment, get in touch, and we'll see if we can go through there. As always, thanks very much for watching. Stay safe in these times of troubles that we're currently involved in, and be good. Till next time.